Everything started around 4 months after the birth of our beautiful baby girl. Our little girl was the sweetest, most gentle little newborn any new parent could have ever asked for. We named our little one after the month she was born, May. May was born on a rainy night when I was the only one in labor on the entire floor. Like any new mother, I was exhausted after hours of labor. All I wanted to do was rest. My husband, Matt, looked after our little one while I rested, but eventually he fell asleep too. I laid in bed, watching my new family sleep peacefully when I felt the need to use the restroom. I called for my nurse and asked her to help me get up. After a few minutes, the nurse came in. I hushed her as she began speaking, pointing at Matt, who was passed out on the sofa. The nurse and I quietly exited and began walking to the bathroom. As we made our way back to my bed, another nurse came in carrying a small blanket. She walked in and began looking around. My nurse asked her who she was looking for, but her coworker looked confused. She explained that as she was walking over to the nurse station, she passed our room and saw a little girl with long black hair standing on her tiptoes, looking at our newborn baby. The nurse mentioned that the little girl was wearing a dress and had no shoes on, so she assumed she might like a blanket since the room was a little chilly. I looked at my nurse, confused and a little worried that someone else's kid could just walk in my room and look at my newborn without anyone but the nurse noticing. I quickly told her that May was my firstborn and that we weren't expecting any visitors. I asked if perhaps the little girl had gotten separated from her parents. However, my nurse quickly mentioned that there was no other families with children on the floor at the moment. A few months after May's birth, Matt and I moved into our new home. We were immediately welcomed by everyone and liked our new neighborhood. As we were unpacking and setting up May's room, I pulled out some baby monitors that we planned on using now that May would be sleeping on her own. Matt and I tested the baby monitors for a while. He went upstairs in May's room while I stayed downstairs in the kitchen. I began making dinner and I left the baby monitor on the counter. As I was cutting vegetables, I began hearing static on the monitor. Thinking that Matt was probably still upstairs testing it, I ignored it. I walked over to the fridge when I heard a faint voice, but the voice did not sound like Matt. I picked up the monitor and pressed it firmly against my ear. A muffled but unidentifiable voice was coming from the static. I realized right away that it sounded like a young child laughing hysterically. I turned around and looked at May. She laid quietly on her swing, sleeping soundly. I tried to make out the noise again when it stopped. The lights on the monitor went down and turned off. Matt came in at the moment through the back door, carrying some tools from the shed, and I asked him if he had taken the baby monitor with him outside. He looked at me and laughed a little. Why would I take it outside? I left it upstairs a little while ago. He set the tools down as I described what I had just heard. He shrugged it off and explained that it was most likely interference from another family's monitor. The following day I took May to the park. We had left home and had begun making our way down the street when my next-door neighbor stopped us. My next-door neighbor was a sweet old lady, and she began talking to May and asked me how everything was going. Agatha was very good around May, excitingly, and began telling me how nice it was to finally have a child in the neighborhood. I asked her if there was other children in the neighborhood. She quickly replied with, "Oh, sweetheart, haven't been any children here in a long time, but it sure is nice to have another family around." As she continued to play with May, I thought back to the baby monitor static. I came to the conclusion that the monitor was most likely broken, and I told myself to remember later to tell Matt that we needed a new one. And that was when Agatha began talking again. She offered her help should I or Matt ever need anyone to babysit. I thanked her for her offer and began pushing May's stroller when she turned towards me and said, "Of course, dear, I understand if you need a break. This little one has quite a mouth, doesn't she?" I heard her cries all night yesterday. I couldn't help but think how strong her lungs are. I looked at her confused and began explaining that May always slept through the night and cried very little. May certainly didn't cry loud or long enough for someone next door to hear it. She nodded and then winked at me. "It's okay, honey. No need to hide it. This is your first one. No one expects you to know everything." She waved goodbye and walked back to our house. That night I told Matt what our neighbor had said, and he laughed, repeating what I had said earlier. May sleeps through the entire night and hardly ever cries. She's crazy or is probably missing her meds. I agreed and asked him to replace the baby monitors before changing the conversation. The next day, Matt installed the new baby monitors before he left for work. May and I stayed home for the rest of the day. We left one baby monitor in May's room, and I left the third one in the kitchen. I was upstairs cleaning our room, which was directly across the hall from May's, when I began hearing the static again. I walked over to the nightstand and sat on my bed, attempting to make out a sound from the baby monitor. Instead of May's cries, I heard the same eerie laughter from the previous monitor. I walked over to May's room while carrying my monitor, and once again she was sound asleep. May's monitor wasn't playing anything as it stood on her dresser, completely silent. The lights didn't even turn on as I heard the laughter through the monitor I was carrying. Thinking it was strange, but not yet giving in to any paranormal explanation, I began walking downstairs to the kitchen when the sound abruptly stopped. I tried to shrug it off and continued cleaning. I thought that the area we lived in made it easier to pick up sounds at a further distance. That night at dinner, I didn't tell Matt about the noise incident earlier that day. Matt seemed tired from work, and I didn't want to worry him with what seemed like nonsense. A few nights after that, I woke up in the middle of the night drenched. Tossing and turning for hours, I decided to get up and check on May. As I walked across the hall towards her room, I heard the static from downstairs. I quietly pushed May's door open to make sure she wasn't awake. She was sleeping peacefully. The static came from the kitchen, and my gut feeling told me it's coming from my monitor. Sleepy and tired, I quickly became annoyed and decided to go downstairs to shut it off. I entered the kitchen and turned on the lights, then reached for the monitor on the counter. I turned the monitor around and was looking for the button to shut it off when I realized that it was already off. I stood there dumbfounded and placed it back on the counter. I began to walk, hoping that I had imagined the whole thing when I heard the static from the monitor again. I turned around immediately and saw that the little lights on the side were on. I walked over, getting ready to throw the monitor across the room when the sound stopped again. As I stood there staring at the monitor, I caught a glimpse of a reflection of the trash bin next to me. For a few seconds I saw what looked like a small child, a little girl reflected on the trash bin, and directly behind me it was. I turned around terrified, expecting to see her. However, no one stood behind me. I looked around desperately, trying to find what had made the reflection when the baby monitor in my hand turned on again. The static cleared. I heard a child laughing and giggling non-stop. I dropped the monitor on the floor and darted upstairs towards May's room. More frightened than I have ever been in my entire life, I picked up May and took her to our bedroom. I woke up Matt, attempting to explain what I had just heard. He woke up still half asleep and went downstairs to check upon what I just saw. He came back upstairs a few minutes later, looking at me like I was crazy. He went back to bed and immediately fell asleep. The next morning, May and I were out front on the porch enjoying the beautiful sunny day when Agatha came over. She looked worn out, nervous, and had dark bags under her eyes. She wore her pajamas, which were noticeably dirty. I greeted her, asking if she wanted any lemonade before she interrupted me. She began complaining about how she had not been able to sleep well these past few days because of May's cries at night. I looked at her confused and explained once again to her that May had not been crying at night. She started to play with her hands nervously and began saying that she could hear May screaming and crying every single night. When she noticed that I didn't believe what she was telling me, her entire personality changed in an instant. She yelled out at me, "Take your little shit away from here! Shut her up or I will!" Feeling threatened, I stood up and went over to May, picking her up while I was asking her to leave. She stood there, looking at May, angry and resentful. She kept yelling at us, which startled May and caused her to begin crying. I threatened her with calling her to leave before she finally decided to storm off. I went inside the house, shaken up and upset that Agatha would act so aggressively. I called Matt and asked him to leave work early. After explaining what had happened, he immediately left the office and started to head home. As soon as he arrived, I explained in more detail what our neighbor had said. He became extremely upset at her behavior. He held May as we talked about what she had said regarding May crying at night. He also didn't understand what our neighbor was complaining about. That doesn't make any sense. May has never given us any grief at night. Our conversation was interrupted by a knock on our door. Thinking it was Agatha, Matt gave May to me, and as he went to open the door, I let out a sigh of relief when our neighbor from across the street came in. Mr. Moss was one of the first friends we made when we moved in. Matt invited him in to sit down, offering him something to drink. Mr. Moss politely declined and said that he came over to talk about us and something important. I laid May on her swing and gave Mr. Moss my complete attention. He explained that earlier that morning he witnessed Agatha's bizarre confrontation with me. He explained that for a few days now Agatha had been acting strange. He first noticed it when he came home late from work one night. He told us that on one particular night, he pulled up to his house after working late when he noticed Agatha outside. She was standing outside in her pajamas on the side of the house while looking up at a window above her. When I asked him for details on the window she was looking up at, he explained that it was the one on the second floor in the front right corner of the house. I looked at Matt nervously at Mr. Moss described May's window. Matt held my hands tightly. Mr. Moss went on to explain that after he pulled up to the driveway, he found it curious that she didn't even turn to look at what car had pulled up onto the cul-de-sac. Not wanting to spook her in case she hadn't noticed him, he went inside his house to continue some work he had still left. He continued to work on his laptop for a couple of hours before deciding to go to sleep. As he was turning off the lights, he looked out the window and noticed that Agatha was still standing in the same spot as she was when he pulled into the driveway hours before. He started fidgeting on the sofa while he spoke to us and nervously looked down at his hands. What he had said next frightened me to the point of our tears. He said that this time, it wasn't just Agatha standing outside. A little girl also stood behind her, staring directly at the window. He estimated the little girl to be no more than 5 years old, and she was wearing a dress and had long black hair. He mentioned that he gasped a little as he looked out the window. The exact girl slowly turned away from the window and turned her head to look his way. He immediately closed his blinds and stayed up the entire night, too frightened to go to sleep. I asked him if he got up to look outside again later, to which he responded no. Matt and I thanked him as he left the house, and we looked at each other deeply concerned about what we had just shared. After a few hours of talking and potentially getting the police involved, Matt got up to use the bathroom. I sat there completely lost in thought when I began hearing the baby monitor from the kitchen yet again. I stood up and ran into the kitchen, and I stared at the monitor while the familiar static slowly cleared to laughter. I picked up the monitor and ran towards the bathroom, pressing it firmly against the door and yelling at Matt to come out. He opened the door asking what was wrong when he stopped to listen to the laughter playing on the monitor. I gave the baby monitor to him as we ran upstairs to May's room. We had put her to sleep upstairs after she passed out on her swing. Matt and I ran inside her room, nervous and scared. She slept in her crib quietly. We looked at each other, confused. The monitor Matt was holding was silent. I stared at it before turning around and shutting it off. We stood there in silence, attempting to rationalize what had just happened. When the monitor in our bedroom turned on, it began playing the same laughter we had just heard. The baby monitor stood up on my nightstand. As Matt and I could both see it clearly from May's room, the laughter got louder and louder as it began playing in all three monitors. I picked up May while scared and crying at the same time. Matt held me as he dropped the monitor he was holding. The laughter changed from a child's laughter to low demonic laughter. May woke up and began crying at the chaos in her room, and Matt and I were getting ready to make a run for it when the laughter from all the three monitors stopped. We were about to run out of the room. Cry! As soon as it said that, we heard a gunshot from the next door. We ran out as fast as we could. I held May tightly against my chest. Other neighbors started to come out of their homes, ready to investigate what had just happened. We bumped into Mr. Moss, waiting for the police to arrive, when two men decided to go inside our next-door neighbor's house and investigate. After a few minutes, one immediately came running out, yelling, "We need an ambulance!" We stood outside for over an hour. Matt and I were still too afraid to go back inside our house to get our car keys. We waited outside among all the police officers and Mr. Moss, hoping to overhear what had happened. A short, stubbly lady that lived a few houses down came up next to us, explaining that she had just overheard one of the men who had gone in to investigate. She said that the men found our next-door neighbor's body sitting in a chair, looking directly out the window with a gunshot in her head. They are stunned to hear that Agatha took her own life. The lady continues speaking. She said that the gun was on the floor and that she had cuts all around her arms, which seemed to be self-inflicted. She went on to explain that directly behind her, written in blood on the wall, she wrote, "She won't stop crying." Matt and I left the majority of our things at the house. We moved across the country and kept in contact with only Mr. Moss over the years. We wanted to leave everything behind and start a new life with May. Nothing strange happened to us for years, and we're perfectly happy to move on. May is now 5 years old. She's a brilliant child, curious, happy, and loving. Matt needed a few things from our storage this week and brought some old boxes home. This morning, May came into the kitchen excited and attempting to get my attention. I was putting away dishes. I had my back turned to her as she kept repeating, "Mom!" "Mom! Listen, the girl is funny! Mom, listen to me!" I finally turned around, thinking she was talking about her next play date next door. When I dropped the plate I was holding on the floor. The plate shattered on the floor, as did my heart when I saw what my little girl was holding next to her ear. May was holding one of the old baby monitors from the old house, and on it I could hear a child's laughter.